Hello there, my name's Bill. I'm excited to present this to you because I believe this is the first time in history all the pieces of the puzzle have been available to be able to put the whole picture together. And the picture I'm talking about is how the Milky Way galaxy works, black holes, the solar system, how the Earth was formed, uh, and this evidence, and there just couldn't have been any. In previous times, nobody had all this information that's available on the internet to put the pieces of the puzzle together. But I'm going to give you pretty solid evidence for the last three. What I call, it's a cyclical polar axis shift, but I call it the Isaiah shift, and it's biblical only in the sense that when I read these certain verses in Isaiah, it motivated me for study. So when I kind of figured out how it worked, I thought that was an appropriate name, and I am going to read those verses real quick. Isaiah 24 verse 1. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. Verse 19. The earth is utterly broken down, the earth is clean dissolved, the earth is moved exceedingly. Verse 20. The earth shall roll to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage. So what would cause to and fro, clean dissolve? That implies a lot of water moving around. I've been studying this for about, really in depth, for about the last 8 or 10 years. I published my initial summary of the theory and my evidence back in July of 2014. So I've learned a lot about it since I published this. So it's a lot to take in, but I guarantee you, if you understand how this works and what I'm talking about, it will be more valuable than a 4-year degree at any university in the world, because none of them are teaching this. None of them have put the pieces of the puzzle together. And I've tried sharing it with the Event Horizon team. I don't even get a reply back from them, so I don't know if this is supposed to be kept, if they know it and it's supposed to be kept secret, or if they haven't put the pieces of the puzzle together, but I'm going to give that to you today. Background, I had very supportive parents that I thank. Got me a good high school education, a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering, and I could have taken anything as a free elective, but I picked ME 307, a graduate level course, and we were allowed a double-sided 8.5 by 11 sheet for the whole year. And here's my sheet. So I understand a little bit about frequencies and cycles and dampening, etc., etc. I've been trained on cycles, and that's where we need to start. So some of them we know, we're pretty familiar with, the solar system. The Earth rotates once every day, once a day. The Moon travels about the Earth once every 28 days. We travel about the solar system as a group every 365.25 days. That's what we call a solar year. And so what's the next cycle? We have the day, solar year, How does that relate to the Milky Way galaxy? There's another cycle there. It's the Milky Way galaxy, and it happens every 6,000 something years, and that's what I call the Isaiah shift, when the galactic cycle hits. So we can't call it a galactic year, I guess, because that's how long it takes for the solar system to go around the Milky Way galaxy. So I'll have to call it something else, but maybe that would be a galactic day. So I hope everybody's with me so far. We're going to take a look at this cycle. This is the Isaiah shift cycle, the galactic cycle. So according to this, we're in a spiral galaxy, right? There's rotation. You see rotation. And it's flat like a disk if you view it from the edge. And the nuclear bulge in the center, well, that's because there's a lot of energy right there in the center of the galaxy. So I'm going to skip a few charts here and explain the black holes. Now science says the galactic center of the Milky Way is defined by a supermassive black hole. Well, people think of a black hole and they think of water going down their drain, that everything's being sucked in. But let me ask you, if everything's being sucked in at the start of that black hole and getting accelerated, where does it come out? That's what I'm looking at. We're looking at what we see in our Milky Way galaxy, a spiral galaxy, is the result of Newton's law says for every action there has to be an equal and opposite reaction. So if we have a black hole that's sucking things in and ejecting all that matter, there has to be an equal and opposing black hole, equal and opposite, same force, opposite direction, shooting matter and whatever gets sucked into those black holes toward the center. So a black hole has to be a system. There has to be a pair of them. So you're going to have one on the top and one on the bottom. And since we know things stay in a disk, the whole system is pressing in from both sides. So your gravity goes all the way to the plane on both sides. Okay? All the way to the plane. Everything is pushing this way. So what happens to the... So I thought of a good way to kind of give you a way you can understand it optically. Okay? Everybody knows that, when you pull the plug on your drain in the northern hemisphere, it rotates in a counterclockwise direction. It spins in a counterclockwise direction. And in the southern hemisphere, it spins in a clockwise direction. So they're really spinning the same direction, but from your perspective, it's clockwise on the southern hemisphere and counterclockwise on the northern hemisphere, but they're both moving the same way. So you have, if we put a drain on the exact North Pole and the exact South Pole and witness that water spinning around that drain and pretended the Earth wasn't there, what would happen? That water would meet in the middle and it would eject that matter out perpendicularly, and all that matter would still be spinning in that direction. That's how a black hole works. So it's not just the slamming the stuff in the center, there's also the rotation to it, and that's what gives our spiral galaxy that rotation. Okay, I'm going to go back to this chart again, because I've kind of, to me, black holes are pretty simple, but I've been studying this for a long time, but there has to be equal and opposite. So there has to be, for every black hole that's sucking in from one direction, there has to be another black hole, pushing against it, equal and opposite. So that's what's happening here. The two black holes, you see that energy. So if we look at this, here's the gravity. Everything is getting spun out and ejected, just like if the Earth wasn't there on the water. It's all spinning. But what happens is you kind of go past. You know, you go past, and then you go back and back and back, because you're going to overshoot. You're going to accelerate and overshoot to one side, and then this gravity is going to slow you down and push you back again, and then this gravity is going to slow you down and push you back again. So what you're going to see is a sine wave. As we're traveling through here, there's a sine wave. And we go through that galactic plane every 6,000 something years. And it's like dropping a pea on a record player, because that plane is spinning around at incredible g-forces. So as we get closer, that could explain crazy weather. It could explain the magnetic shift that we're seeing, magnetic north shift that we're seeing somehow. I don't know if it relates to that, but I do know that every between 6 to 7,000 years, our solar system goes from one side of the Milky Way galaxy to the other side. So let's talk about how the Earth was formed. You had big stuff coming down there, right? It all gets exploded in the center. The Earth was, either formed by either partially already frozen rock, tangible instead of liquid. But for the most part, it's a molten ball with a hard crust on it. So what makes the most sense is two much larger objects crashed into each other, and the Earth was a little droplet that came off of those, for example, a little molten droplet, and then it cooled off and formed a crust. And then the crust got thicker. We're still going through there. It's still violent. Every time we go through that. And then eventually, I'm going to go back to that one too. That's evidence for recent stuff. I want the Grand Canyon. Okay, so different stuff started cooling at different rates. As water started condensing, we started getting erosion. So, one thing I learned, I always see pictures of the solar system as a plane like this, and the galaxy like this, so I thought we went through like that. And then a friend of mine, Jeff at work, said no. He said the solar system is perpendicular to the Milky Way galaxy, and that made all the sense in the world. So that's why we have Antarctica is kind of key to this. Antarctica. Those galactic rotational gravitational forces are always acting on the Earth in a South Pole to North Pole direction. South Pole to North Pole direction. So let's take a look at how the Earth is situated. We have the continental divide here. The continental divide, the Rocky Mountains. It goes all the way from Canada through Colorado, New Mexico, all the way through Mexico, to the point where, it still keeps the Gulf or the Atlantic away from the Pacific, where we had to cut a canal through it down here to be able to take ships through here from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So that thing's like a big wiper. A big wiper. So when we go through this, I'm going to switch to a smaller globe. When we go through this, we're rotating around. When we get close to that center, the forces are going to increase and increase and increase, and the gravity is going to push the water from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. So as we're rotating around, this acts like a big swiper, this continental divide through the Rocky Mountains, so that as it's, whatever was dissolving and could get washed up, got laid up going through here, between the Rocky Mountains. And that's what created all these different layers in the Grand Canyon. Each one of these rocks is whatever was kind of forming and eroding at the time that the water took to the northern hemisphere that backed up against these Rocky Mountains. It backed up in this area right here. And so this is, I forget, this is about 80, I think this is, I have this in Isaiah shift, so approximately 80, yeah, I think that might be millions, I forget on this chart. But this is, you know, as more water condensed and different materials were eroded, that's what left these different layers of material, whatever was dissolved in the water, that backed up against the Grand Canyon and formed the Grand Canyon until approximately 30 million years ago. Instead of depositing another layer of sediment here and creating another layer of rock, it started cutting through. So it started forming 80 million, 80 units. I forget exactly what I have for that unit on that, and the different periods. And then 30 million years ago is when it started cutting through, and it's been cutting through ever since. So what's going to happen the next time we go through the Isaiah shift, and it pushes the water to the North America, into the northern hemisphere, and that Grand Canyon once again acts like a big swiper. But instead of getting all the way to the top, it's going to be somewhere down here. It's going to let it out, and that explains. So the Grand Canyon kind of protects Asia over here, where the water backs up, and that's why I believe cultures are oldest in the east and younger as we get to the west, to where in North America, Europeans didn't come here till 1492. So, but that's the Grand Canyon. So that is I think pretty much indisputable proof for some type of cyclical event that left layer of sediment, layer of sediment, layer of sediment, layer of sediment, until it finally started cutting through. And then that's what we have today. We have the Grand Canyon that cuts through all the sedimentary rock down into the to the schist. So, and I've gone through and I've seen the schist at the bottom of some of those more fun whitewater canyons. So, let's see, what else do we have here? We did this one. Okay, Milky Way galaxy. Let's check my notes. We talked about Newton's third law, equal and opposite. Description, rotating disk. What forces are necessary to do that? You have to have gravity on both sides that keeps it in the disc shape, and you get the rotation from the whirlpool, just like you know, the water in your sink. Okay, let's see, the solar system. At some point in time, you know, our sun was formed in that. Whenever it went into the galactic explosion, it was formed the same way, and maybe it absorbed other stuff. But this theory also explains why all the planets are different. We didn't somehow be birthed by the sun and cool off, because we're not made of the same material as the sun. We're not made of the same, Earth isn't made of the same material as any of the planets. They all had different stuff colliding and then formed the way they did, and the sun kind of picked them up, because we all have a south to north direction that we're spinning around, going through here, and at different times different planets were collected. You know, because first off, it's almost impossible. In fact, well, it is impossible for the moon to capture, or excuse me, for the Earth to capture the moon as a satellite without it eventually decaying into Earth's orbit and crashing with the Earth. It's virtually impossible without an external force for the moon to be traveling laterally, get caught at exactly the proper speed and proper distance to go into orbit. It doesn't happen. But, and you know, this explains why moon's orbit doesn't decay into Earth's, because when we go through that, when we go through the galactic plane in this in the south to north direction, the Earth spends a different amount of time in it than the moon does. You know, maybe the moon even goes through twice. You know, it goes down here once on the way down and again on the way back, and the Earth only goes through once. But that upsets the moon enough where it gets into that wobble orbit again. You know, wobble orbit, because it orbits like this. It doesn't orbit steady state. It orbits in a figure 8. It upsets the two, and that's what keeps the moon orbit from degrading into the Earth and crashing into the Earth. Isaiah Shift explains that. Isaiah Shift explains why Neptune spins the opposite direction as all the other planets. It explains why Jupiter has a moon that has active volcanoes on it. Again, at one point there was two large objects collided and a little droplet came out and started to cool, and then it got gathered up in Jupiter's orbit during an Isaiah shift. It explains how that moon is there. It explains so many things. Okay, so solar system. Earth, how did it form? Molten mass, cooling, mountains, etc. Cooled, crust formed, eventually water condensed, erosion, sedimentary rock, Grand Canyon. I live in the Midwest and I drive through limestone cuts all the time on my way to work. The only way to explain those limestone is, first off, if the whole world was covered with water all the time while that limestone was formed, it wouldn't be in layers. It would just be one continuous layer, because there would be nothing to break up the different layers of sediment. But when that water backed up against the Grand Canyon, some of that water kept, left layers of limestone in Missouri that we have to cut out. So for like a Noah's flood, no, the whole world wasn't flooded. There was, we didn't all of a sudden have an extra 30,000 of sea level that covered the whole world. No, it was the south to north forces when we go through an Isaiah shift that pushed the water from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. So it was local flooding. And yeah, so, okay, let's see. My evidence here. We already talked about the Grand Canyon not pushed up, or schist would be on top. If it formed, in layers this way, well, sedimentary rock can only be formed by leaving, water leaving deposits. So there's no way, it hasn't moved at all from the beginning. This part of the crust is still in the same place. It didn't push up. No, it left layers. The Colorado River didn't cut the Grand Canyon as it was forming. The Grand Canyon River is the result of when it started cutting through during Isaiah shifts. So, during an Isaiah shift, the water might come up to here. Normally, it's right down here at the bottom. So, okay, Grand Canyon. Mummified seals, Yellowstone diatoms. Let's talk about the Yellowstone diatoms. And again, this is somebody else did the research and published the paper, and I said, ha! I can explain it, and that's evidence for my theory. So Yellowstone diatoms, they did some studies. They went to Yellowstone Lake and they took samples. This was back in 1971, 1972, and when they did the samples, they had layer, very uniform layers, going back 11,298 layers. Okay? And then there was a murky part. And then they found some other layers that at the bottom of this murky layer, which I have Ice Age written here, and they found different Yellowstone diatoms down here. So they think that these diatom A, live down here, and then during this murky period where they don't have any layers, that it somehow transformed a diatom A to diatom B that they found up here. But that's not what happened. There used to be a diatom, let's see, we're close enough, 11,298 plus 43. We're close enough. That's almost a multiple of 6,000 years, right? But I can still explain that. So we know that 2 Isaiah shifts ago, the ice melted off of Yellowstone Lake, and a different diatom came in and lived there after that. This one was just the one that lived here before the Ice Age. While Yellowstone Lake was frozen under a local ice age, because at that point it was closer to the rotational Earth. So it was frozen for at least 1, maybe 2 6,000-year cycles. So, and the reason this is not quite 12,000 yet is because when the Earth shifted so that now Yellowstone was in a more temperate climate, the ice started receding. And it took a little while for the ice to recede till the water was melted and these layers could resume. So you had a ramp up as it froze, suddenly ramp up, stayed cold during the cycle, and then melted. So we know that diatom B was here for 2 Isaiah shift cycles. We had at least 1 or 2 here, and then a different diatom lived back there. So this is solid evidence of a sudden climate shift. I'm going to save my mummified seals for last, because that's just incredible. But we have some other here. Scientists present prehistoric puppy found in permafrost in Russia. Real quick, ancient Russian scientists on Monday showed off a prehistoric puppy believed to be 18,000 years, found in permafrost in the country's far east. Discovered last year in a lump of frozen mud near the city of Yakutsk, the puppy is unusually well preserved with its hair, teeth, whiskers, eyelashes still intact. Puppy has all its limbs, blah blah blah, blah blah blah. When the puppy, let's see. Why has Yakutia come through as a real spate of such unique findings over the last decade? First, it's global warming. Well, it's getting warmer at that location right now, maybe. It really exists. We feel it. The local winter comes later, spring comes earlier. Let's see. First step was to send the sample to radiocarbon dating to see how old it was, and when we got the results back, that it was roughly 18,000 years old. So here's biological evidence that there was a sudden shift where, and in this case, that where that puppy froze in the permafrost now, it's been frozen it got suddenly frozen before it could decompose or another predator could eat it. It got covered over with water, buried in mud. That was the flood, and then all of a sudden it was frozen. And that, in other words, this part of Siberia is on the edge of what's melting from the last shift, and it's been frozen for 3 shifts. It's been frozen. So here we have essay. Here's the part about frozen mammoths. In the early part of this century, the famous Berezovka mammoth carcasses was discovered in Siberia. It says was, it should have been were. Nearly intact, the animal was found buried in silty gravel, sitting in the upright position. The mammoth had a broken foreleg, evidently caused by a fall from a nearby cliff 10,000 years ago. So that's evidence of 2 shifts ago. The remains of his stomach were intact, and there were grasses and buttercups lodged between his teeth. The flesh was still edible, but reportedly not tasty. No one has ever satisfactorily explained, until now, how the Berezovka mammoth and other animals found frozen in the subarctic could have been frozen before being consumed by predators of the time. Some have proposed a sudden change in climate, but this hardly seems a likely explanation. They put their finger right on it. A sudden climatic change. Alright, let's see. Flash frozen mammoths. We just talked about them. The flash frozen dog, 18,000 years ago. The Piri Reis map. Do I have it up here? No. Piri Reis is a map they found that shows Antarctica with different coastlines and everything than it looks like now. The Piri Reis map. Okay, let's see. Flash frozen mammoths. So I covered the first page of my notes. Okay. Alrighty. I'm saving this for last. I guess what I'm gonna do now is a couple years ago I found a video of flash, of mummified sea lion carcasses that were some distance from the current coast of Antarctica, and my jaw just about dropped when the narrator said some of these carcasses have carbon dated to 6,000 years old. One Isaiah shift ago. Obviously the seal did not, I believe the word for how a seal moves is scrunching. Obviously it didn't scrunch all the way up there in a desert to die of thirst and no food. What really happened was that seal was on the bank getting out of the ocean. The ocean was right there, probably sunning itself on the beach, and all of a sudden the tide went out and kept going out until it found itself kilometers from where the ocean is now. So I tried to search for that video again and I couldn't find it, but I found one that was even better. When you watch this video, the only way this glacier could have formed 2 mountain ranges away from the current coast with the mummified seal right next to it is after the last Isaiah shift, before the last Isaiah shift, that part of Antarctica was the coastline, and that's when the ice formed. That's when the ice formed, and then after the shift, it became a desert, and it mummified that seal, and left a big iceberg. There's no snow. It's a desert, but there's a big ice cube there. There's no other explanation for how that big ice cube formed. So I'm going to splice that in and include a link to it later. But that's my evidence for an Isaiah shift 6,000 years ago. And also let's talk a little.
The eyes just seem kind of haunted to me. Like, where on earth did you think you were going? How did you end up here on this ridge? Like, how did you get up here? There's literally this giant glacier cutting off this whole section, this giant mountain range. And to get here from the ocean, you'd have to cross over that mountain range, over this glacier, to end up here. It's amazing how something like that happens.
A little bit real quick about the book of Genesis and Noah and the Tower of Babel. After the last Isaiah shift, it greatly reduced the population, but more so you get a flood in the northern hemisphere, you get a drought in the southern hemisphere. So you'll notice that most of your animals in the southern hemisphere and Africa, pretty close to the equator, are more suited for dry climates. Camels, and Australia has all its own wildlife. But let's look at here. Okay, North America. We know the water backs up. We know the water backs up against the Rocky Mountains and pretty much flooded all of North America. So what did we have left? There were a few Indian tribes, Native American Indians, that that could get on mountains high enough to survive. And then especially in the Northwest where they could get on, get above the water, they survived. They survived. South America too. And this thing could explain why the Aztecs were wiped out. It could have been a flood. It explains why you find all kinds of dinosaurs buried in one location, because when the flood hit, because it happened when they were here too, they got washed down and they got sediment left on them, and they got buried by an Isaiah shift flood. So we've kind of already covered North America, and then we get over here, China, same thing. Chinese people survived the flood. That's why they speak a different language and have different genes than all these other people. Hawaiians, related to here, but different. Speak a different language. Let's go over here. We have Spain speaks a different language than France, speaks a different language than Italy and Germany, and I could go on. Finland, the Norwegians, everybody speaks different languages. There was pockets of people that survived the last flood. Noah wasn't the only one. But his story, his story, they landed on Mount Ararat, and they're telling the history as they knew it from their location, because when the ark left them there, they assumed that it was a global flood and everybody on earth was dead but them. But the evidence doesn't suggest that. There were cultures and survivors all through the world. And to think that penguins, who only live in the Antarctic, somehow made it to up here to Mount Ararat and got back to Antarctica without leaving a clue, it didn't happen. They survived, Australia, I saw something the other day. They said that they identified a pure strain of DNA that goes back 72,000 years. Once again, a multiple of 6. And right away I thought the Australian Aborigines, and that's who it is. So they have no mixed genes at all from any of these other cultures for the last 12 Isaiah shifts. The last 12. That's why the Aborigines are so unique, because there wasn't global travel. They didn't get off. They're not descendants of Noah up here in Mount Ararat, and somehow made it as a unique DNA group to Australia, not related to Noah. And as far as the creation, let's remember that story also. The only account we have of the book of Genesis had to come through Noah. If Noah was the only surviving family, that history, he had to somehow preserve that. And without paper, rock, written language, it was all mouth to mouth. And as they started roaming out and encountered these other civilizations, I believe the Tower of Babel was created to explain what they observed. So I'm sorry about that, but that's what I believe. I think I covered just about everything. It makes a lot of sense. It's supported. I got lots of evidence for you that it happens every 6,000 years. I got geologic evidence through the Grand Canyon where it's gone back, since water condensed and started adding layers to the Grand Canyon. So I thank you for watching. And something. Okay, let's go through my notes. Modern history: Noah. All of Genesis before, had to have been word of mouth from Noah on down. And, you have the telegraph example where you start with this, and by the time 30 people tell the story, it's different. The flood was an Isaiah shift. What he described, he thought was a global flood, was a local flood when the gravitational forces in the galactic plane are going to increase until they peak in a flood in the northern hemisphere, and then once we pass through that plane, they're going to decrease, and the water's going to go back where it was. and there's going to be seeds washed everywhere. It's kind of a rebirth. But that kind of explains the, the verse, clean dissolved. The water cleans the northern hemisphere. Ice ages are local. So let's, as an example of ice ages, I say ice ages are local. We know that Yellowstone in North America was covered in ice 10,000, 12,000 years ago, right? So we assume that the whole northern hemisphere. No, it was just a shift of the ice where we went from being part of the Arctic Circle to now we're not part of the Arctic Circle. So I don't know if this is a good representation, but this is perhaps, this is kind of what's going to happen. You can see our North Pole there is that dot. Okay, that's our North Pole, and there's our South Pole. So what's going to happen is we're going to be rotating about a different plane, and it explains why there are petrified trees 100 feet deep that are still rooted in off the coast of Florida, because at a previous Isaiah shift, it wasn't 100 feet of water. It was at ground level, and that's when that tree grew. So that's kind of what we're looking at. So what's going to happen? When the shift hits, all the ice is on one side, and then it has to melt off on this side and refreeze on the other side. So you have an ice age over here. It's not over here, but it's coming. It's coming. So, and that's why I believe we're finding stuff now, because all those mammoths, they're just on the edge where they're finally thawing out where we can find them. But it's going to take, in other words, it'll take more than 6,000 years for that ice cap to fully melt and reform. So it's always dynamic. That's why, you might have glaciers getting deeper on one side of North America, but they're calving on the other side, because it's a constant thing. And that's why after 6,000 years, that glacier in Antarctica has not yet melted. It hasn't melted yet. It's been there 6,000 years. It hasn't added any snow, any water to it, and after 6,000 years, it still hasn't melted. So there's my evidence. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, leave me a comment, and I'll do the best I can to explain it. Thank you very much, and I hope it helps explain some things for you. So you might be wondering when the next Isaiah shift is going to occur, and I do not know exactly when that will be, because I don't know how many years it was since the last one and how many years there are in between. However, I've had experiences that I know for a fact that we are spiritual beings and that we get information from sources other than our five senses. So a few years ago, one of my friends who was familiar with my theory shared his son's school project with me, and it was called the crystal ball. What do you see in the crystal ball is the question, and they were supposed to, draw a picture of it and write a little bit about it. And here's what he said. The crystal ball said in the next 10 years, the Earth's gravity will go to 0 gravity. The bad part is that everything will float away. Even the oceans and you. So you have to prepare. First you find something to hold on to and lock your house, and that's it. So I thought that was extremely interesting what he's describing from the northern hemisphere, when the Milky Way's gravitational plane exerts the force in the south to north direction. In the northern hemisphere, it will feel like 0 gravity. So here's some information that in the next 10 years that this prophecy says Isaiah shift is going to occur in the next 10 years. So maybe that's a clue. But the other bad thing is that he sent this to me about 5 years ago. So the calendar is now, this could happen in 5 years. Okay, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, put a note in the comments and I'll try to address it. Thank you very much.